Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to join our symposium tonight. And this is the symposium presented by New England Chinese American Alliance, and also co-sponsored by Newton Education Support Network. All right. In the recent month, the number of Asian hate crimes has significantly increased around this nation. A numerous amount of Stop Asian Hate activities has been previous from coast to coast. New England Chinese American Alliance has hosted a grand event rally along the Boston Marathon route to call for Stop Asian Hate, with more than 1,000 runners running through 8 towns and cities. 2 days ago, the Congress had passed the bill to counter the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. As the fellow Asian Americans in other states, we in Massachusetts also realize and agree that some stereotypes have been applied to Asian Americans, and "you don't belong here" is one of them. Asian Americans have been living in the country the same long as other races. The first Asian documented in the US arrived in 1587 when Filipinos landed in California. The 20,000 Chinese Americans made the transcontinental railroad happen. There are more important stories about Asian Americans and the Pacific Islanders to be known and must be known. It's the time to add AAPI history into the K-12 education, which should have been there from day one. A bill to require adding Asian American history into K-12 education has been passed in Illinois last month. NECAA, along with the activists from Concord and Acton, including but not limited to Xiaoyang and Don Wang and Vivian Tan, have been working for a way to promote this bill in Massachusetts. We found that our Chinese Vietnamese American fellow activist Mai Du has been working with State Representative Erica Uterhoven since last year on the bill H584. This could be the closest bill to the request, and more volunteers with passions are needed for this bill. May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Today is the first event of NECAA's series Roundtable Symposium for the AAPI Heritage Month. It's our great honor to have Professor Watanabe as the keynote speaker and a panel of distinguished speakers, Sam Young from Asian American Commission chairperson, and also Mai Du and Erica, to talk with our community about our story, our current story, our future, our history, our bill, our rights, and how we can speak out loud. Without further ado, let me introduce today's moderator, Li Song Liu. Professor Li Song Liu is from Massachusetts College of Arts and Design and an associate in research at Harvard Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. He teaches Asian American history, East Asian history, world history, and US-China relations. His current research focuses on Chinese American history in the greater Boston area. Li Song, please.
Thank you very much, Ben, for the kind introduction. And I welcome everyone for coming to this very important community event tonight. It's a great honor to be the moderator for this distinguished panel. Before I introduce our important speakers, I want to thank you, Ben, for your tireless leadership and for all the support from NECAA, the New England Chinese American Association, and NESN, Newton Education Support Network, without which this event won't be possible. I also want to thank our speakers for taking the time to talk to us tonight, despite their numerous other professional and family obligations. All our speakers are prominent community leaders with great achievements in their own fields. And we're gathering together because of the same passion and the same mission: restore the rightful place of AAPI history in school curriculum. which has been urgent more than ever considering the surging anti-Asian hate in this nation since the beginning of the pandemic. In a minute, you will hear from these experts and leaders why teaching AAPI history is important and how to secure its right place in school curriculum, including the current legislation in Massachusetts. The bill proposed by State Representative Erica, who is here tonight with us, along with her colleague, Representative Lika Elugado at the State House. The bill has its deep root in the community and has been promoted and supported by leaders at various fields, including our other panelists tonight. Its global goal cannot be achieved without more grassroots movement and more conversations and support from everyone here. So for tonight's symposium, we will first have Professor Watanabe deliver the keynote speech, followed by individual presentations by our three panelists. For the last 20 to 30 minutes, we will have the Q&A session for our speakers to elaborate on some of their main points and also to answer the questions from the audience. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat and we will collect them for the Q&A session. Now let me introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Watanabe. Professor Watanabe is Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Institute for Asian American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Besides his cutting-edge scholarship that have appeared in the leading journals of his field, Professor Watanabe has played a leadership role in many organizations and programs. He served on President Obama's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and as the first chair of the U.S. Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. He is the president of the board of directors of the NECAA Student Relocation Commemorative Fund, a member of the advisory board of the New Americans Integration Institute, the board of directors of the South Shore Health System, and the board of trustees of the Harry Doe Memorial Legend Assistance Fund. It's our great honor to have him with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Watanabe.
Thank you very much, Lee Song, and thank you for all the organizers of this wonderful event and my co-panelists, the wonderful activist, Mai, the wonderful community activist, Sam, the head of the Asian American Commission, and Erica, one of the really path-breaking legislators of Asian American descent. So thank you all, and I really look forward to listening to and learning from each of you as I always do. And let me begin with, can you put up the first slide, please? Is it up? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, 1 second. I'm trying to get it on screen.
I mean, they are not necessary, so if not, that's fine. Well, I'm going to describe what was going to be on it. And the picture I was going to describe is one that's maybe familiar to almost every student who takes American history in the United States. And that's the picture of the two trains coming together in Promontory Point, Utah, about 40 miles north of where I grew up in Bingham Canyon, Utah, which marked the point at where the Transcontinental Railroad, the trains coming from east to west, met in Promontory Point, Utah in 1869. And it celebrates that moment. It's a picture that people can see in their head if they can't see it on the screen right now. And it's a picture where the two trains come together and you see all these people surrounding it, celebrating the moment at which the Golden Spike is driven in 1869. And there are dozens of men in that picture. And yet in that picture, which you're sort of going to see here in a minute, I think. Maybe not. Okay, in that picture, and I've looked at it with a magnifying glass, there is not a single person who is Chinese in that picture, not a single Chinese person. This is the picture, and I thought somebody, maybe a Chinese person, would try to do a Where's Waldo, you know, sneak into the picture or something, but that didn't even happen. And people says, so what? So what if there's not a Chinese person in this picture? What's the significance of that? Well, the significance of that is that the Transcontinental Railroad, particularly in the part building it from west to east, the most treacherous part of it, was not built by Leland Stanford, as most history books will tell you. He's the guy who financed it. But the people who actually built it were 90% of the labor that built that railroad were Chinese American laborers. They're the ones who did the treacherous work of building through and blasting through the Sierra Nevada mountains and the heated deserts in Nevada. They're the ones who actually built the railroad. And yet at this moment, celebrating the completion of this feat, Chinese Americans were absent. They were invisible from this picture. And I want to show you another slide here. In the next slide, there is this book, and it's the standard history book of American immigration history. And the title of it is The Uprooted, the Epic Account of the Great Migrations That Made the American People. This book is by a former Harvard historian, Oscar Hanlon, and for the last 70 years has been the standard history of immigration to the United States. And it's interesting, in this epic account, this Pulitzer Prize-winning epic account, there is not a single word about the epic account of those who came not across the Atlantic into Ellis Island in New York, figuratively speaking, but those who came across the Pacific and came through Angel Island in San Francisco Harbor. Not a single word about those people who came across that journey in terms of this epic account of the great migrations that made the American people. And that's why, for example, in other words, we're invisible, we're not included, we're erased from this history as well. And that's why the next slide, a University of California professor, Ronald Takaki at the time, decided he was going to make Asian Americans visible by telling their story. And he wrote a book called Strangers from a Different Shore to correct this invisibility. And notice the title he chose, Strangers from a Different Shore, a history of Asian Americans. And thus here in the United States in the year 2021, I would argue that we are still strangers to most Americans. I think less is known about Asian Americans than any other major racial group in the United States of America. And less is known about our condition and experience than any other group. And this is despite the fact that it has been pointed out, we have been in the United States for well over 200 years. And we are in fact the fastest growing racial group in the United States and in Massachusetts. Indeed, we have been here in large numbers for well over 200 years, as has been pointed out. There are over 220 million people in the United States today who trace their ancestry to Asia, about 500,000 in Massachusetts alone, and about 65,000 in the city of Boston. And this fast growth has been attached to one phenomenon more than anything, and that is immigration. Immigration has been the basis upon which we have grown so rapidly in the United States. But this immigration has meant that there's great diversity and there is great complexity amongst the Asian American group. There are nearly 20 Asian ethnic groups in Massachusetts alone, with more than 1,000 people in them. From the largest Asian ethnic group in Massachusetts with 175,000 or so, the Chinese American group, to the smallest amongst the 20 with 1,000 or more, to the Bhutanese, but yet there are even 1,000 Bhutanese in Massachusetts as well. And there thus are 20 groups with 1,000 or more Asian ethnic groups within Massachusetts with 1,000 or more members in Massachusetts alone. We are clearly diverse in terms of ethnic background, but we're also diverse in terms of socioeconomic diversity and in terms of complexity, in terms of income, in terms of educational attainment, in terms of poverty rates, etc. That is, Asian Americans are far from a unified model minority by any means. There's nothing monolithic about us. And that is why to understand Asian Americans, to understand and to serve them better, we need to understand this tremendous complexity. And I must say, this is why we need to have disaggregated data on this population to serve it better and to serve the entire community of Asian Americans better. And that's another piece of legislation that I would urge us all to look into as a better way to serve our communities and to serve us all together, is to understand this diversity and to record that diversity and to recognize that diversity by getting disaggregated data about it. Now, of course, what are the consequences of being relatively invisible? This is the question that I have, this relative erasure, this invisibility that I talk about. When a history and the experience of a particular group is often lost or not seen, they're often marginalized. They are constructed by external forces. In this case, it's the dominant society that constructs how the rest of the society feels about us. They impose, as has been suggested, stereotypes. What we call in the idea of racial construction, they impose racializations. Racial meanings are given to various communities. And for Asian American, the racializations that are predominant, there have been two of them. One of which I'm going to speak at length, and the second, which I'm sure others might address as well in today's discussion. The first, which I'm not going to speak of at great length, is a model minority mythology. And that has had a very strong impact on the way Asian Americans are perceived, particularly not in terms of Asian Americans themselves, but their relationship to other non-white communities in the United States. But secondly, there is a way in which Asian Americans are racialized, which really is an attempt to discipline them. I think the model minority myth is utilized to discipline Blacks and other groups in the United States. But the perpetual minority racialization, the notion that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners, tied principally not to the United States, but to their countries of origin. And when I say countries of origin, they could be here in the United States for generations, and yet they are still, in some respects, their connection for the land of their ancestors is blurred. We are perceived as perpetual foreigners, as in some ways un-American, as some ways tied to what is the behavior back of the descendants of the homelands from which we come, and not for our behavior here in the United States. And we see this dimension reflected several times in the sort of interactions we find as Asian Americans on a daily basis, of course. The notion of where are you really from, that sort of idea. Or the notion, like a friend of mine told me the other day, he went to a new Chinese restaurant and he said, I asked him how it was, and he says it was a great restaurant. And I said, how did you know it was good? And he says, well, one of the things, the food was good. And he says, and this was a white person told me, it says, and I was the only American there. And I know what they meant. They meant that not that they were the only white people there. And but when they said they're the only American there, I said, gee, what'd you do? Go around checking people to find out what their immigration status was or so forth? Because his notion was that if they weren't white, if they were Chinese or if they were Asian, that some ways they weren't American. And this notion this idea came very clearly to me in terms of looking at the 1998 Nagano Olympic Games. The Winter Olympic Games, the number one sport in the Winter Olympic Games in terms of the way in which popularity and so forth is, of course, the idea of the Women's Figure Skating Championship. It's the number one sport. And in that sport, the competition in 1998 was between two skaters, Tara Lipinski and Michelle Kwan. And when the results of the competition were announced on one of the major networks, this is the way they announced it: American beats Kwan. Now, of course, what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture is Tara Lipinski, the winner, actually wasn't American, but so was Michelle Kwan, who is Chinese American, born, I think, in Walnut Creek or something, California. And yet the Chinese American was perceived not as truly American, and the American beats Kwan was the way in which they captured this notion that Michelle Kwan, the figure skater, the world championship figure skater, was perceived in some respects as less American, as a perpetual foreigner, as not American. And of course, this notion of perpetual foreignness has impacted not just attitudes, but the laws and the political reality of Asian Americans since the first time they stepped on these shores. From the very beginning of coming to this country as a nation of immigrants, Asian Americans had been in a position for most of their time in the United States as immigrants, as aliens ineligible for citizenship. So think about this. They're in the United States in a position of being aliens ineligible for citizenship. This nation, which prides itself on the idea that people come from all over the world and decide to stay here and build the American family, the Asians were locked out for that. For most of their period of time in the United States, Asian Americans have been in that situation. I'm Japanese American, for example. Japanese Americans could not become citizens of the United States of America, even as immigrants, until 1952. If you think about that period of time, since the beginnings of their coming to the United States, and for Japanese Americans, it meant the mid-19th century coming to the United States. For that period of time, they could not become, for over 100 years, could not become citizens, even as they immigrated to the United States. And then, of course, there's exclusion, the notion of actually preventing an immigrant group from coming to the United States in the first place. And in 1882, we told the Chinese Americans with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, for the first time, you cannot come to the United States because of the country you come from and because of your race. And that's for the first time. And think about the significance of that in 1882, because up until that time, there's no such thing as an illegal immigrant or an undocumented immigrant, because we essentially let anybody come to the United States up to that point. But for the first time, we decided to do so in 1882, and thus invented the term documented immigrant or illegal immigrant with the bringing of the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And many people might say, back in 1882, as they do today, who are anti-immigrant, for example, coming to the United States, they say, maybe we don't have anything against the Chinese immigrants. It's just we're having too many immigrants come to our country and we can't really have enough jobs for them or something we can't really provide for all of these immigrants. They're just having too many immigrants coming to the United States. And I went back and looked at the data. In 1882, there were in fact 39,000 immigrants coming from China to the United States. That was the peak year of Chinese immigration to the United States. So maybe there's something to this story, that maybe we have too many immigrants coming. But of course, the country to which more Americans trace their ancestry then and today is, of course, what country? Does anybody know? It's Germany. Germany is a country to which more Americans trace their ancestry then and now than any country. And I went back and looked at the data, and sure enough, 1882 was the peak year of German immigration to the United States up to that point. And the figure was 250,620 German people came to the United States in 1882. 250,000 Germans, 39,000 Chinese. We had the Chinese Exclusion Acts of 1882. We did not have the German Exclusion Acts of 1882, even though the number of Germans was significantly greater. See, race was a factor. Racism was a factor. Racism joined with nativism is a very powerful force in American society. And then following the exclusion of Chinese in 1882, ultimately in 1924, there was essentially a complete closure of the country to all Asian immigrants in 1924. And that was followed in 1942 by the most profound and clearest example of perpetual foreignness, when people like my family were placed in America's concentration camps as Japanese Americans during World War II, were young and old, citizen and non-citizen alike, without any habeas corpus, without any trial, without any call, were simply because of the fact they were Japanese Americans. And they could be like my brother, who was born 5 days before Pearl Harbor, or you could be a 90-year-old person living in a nursing home and be brought and be placed in a concentration camp in America, simply because you look like the enemy, not because you were the enemy. And that's a clear example of the perpetual foreignness, but that's not the only one. Subsequent to that, whether you talk about Vincent Chin, or you talk about Wen Ho Lee, or whether you talk about the impact after 9/11 upon our South Asian brothers and sisters, the attacks placed upon them, misguided attacks after 9/11, or the COVID-19 crisis, as we've seen, when the virus is sort of wrongly described as though it was coming from China, or even in the Atlanta shootings of a couple of weeks ago, or even the FedEx shootings in Indianapolis, where we got to realize half of the victims there were people of Asian American descent. Our Sikh brothers and sisters were killed in large numbers in the FedEx shootings as well. In all these cases, to some extent, we see the perpetuation of this notion of perpetual foreignness and exclusion as the basis for dealing with this Asian American population. So in short, historically, there's been a systematic and deliberate drive for exclusion, legally, socially, and politically, of Asian Americans. We have denied them the right to immigrate to the United States for a period of time. We have denied them the right to naturalize. We have denied them the right of civil and political rights. We placed them in segregated schools. We have denied them the right to own land. We have removed them and placed them in concentration camps, as we did with Japanese Americans during World War II. And today, as has been pointed out, we shout at our kids in schools or our elders on the street, go back to where you came from, go back to where you belong, which is nothing more than a statement of the notion of exclusion, if there ever was one. The notion you don't belong is exclusion. It's saying you don't belong within our society. So what do we do about it? Well, during APA, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, as people have pointed out, we have an opportunity here to remember and to honor our history, our culture, and our accomplishments and our experience and our achievements as Asian Americans. This is a critical thing that we should do. We should recognize and honor what we have done and recognize and be visible about what we have achieved. Visibility is going to mean pride. It's not going to mean we're not going to remain invisible any longer, because self-esteem and pride are based upon visibility. We've got to be willing to say proudly that we are people of Asian American descent, Asian descent here in the United States. And that's why, for example, as this next picture shows, the no longer invisible. This is a picture taken of that same picture that was taken in 1869, taken 150 years later by Corky Lee. And Corky Lee is a critical figure here. Corky Lee passed away of COVID-19 this past winter, a few months ago. And for almost 50 years of his 70 years or so on Earth, he was the principal chronicler of the Asian American movement throughout the history of the United States of the last half century. And Corky, a couple years ago at the 150th anniversary of this, decided he would go to Utah, where there is this, they have these two trains set up as though they did in 1869. And he would reclaim that spot for Chinese Americans and for Asian Americans. So he got 200 Asian Americans, mostly Chinese, some of them descendants of those workers who built that railroad 150 years ago. And he reclaimed the space, and he said it's going to be our space, the space that we were kept from being a part of. He says we're going to claim it as our space, and this is the picture that he took. And in my mind, we are no longer invisible, is what he said. We're no longer willing to be erased, as he said. Now, what is the unfinished work of Asian Americans and for all of us? About 120 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois said that the problem of the color line is the problem of the next century. And here in 2021, the next century after that, it is still the principal problem in the United States, I say, the color line. This is as we approach a country that will be majority non-white in about 25 years or so. We're going to be a majority non-white America in about 25 years ago. Think about that. The color line was sadly reinforced last summer and recently in places like Minneapolis, in Ferguson, Missouri, in Atlanta, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in Belmont, Massachusetts, in Brookline, along the US-Mexico border. We have seen what Martin Luther King called the shameful condition of America has been on display. Racial hierarchies persist, inequities remain in the American experience. In terms of the COVID crisis in the United States and the pandemic, we have seen a situation in which Asian Americans have been blamed and bullied for the China virus. Blamed and bullied not just by the kids down the street, but by the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States under President Trump. But even worse, because we have been blamed and bullied, but not even worse, we have been beaten to death. We have been shot at with high-powered weapons. We have been slashed with knives. We've had chemicals poured on us. We have had gone on with days with hardly a day without an elderly person being shoved or kicked or beaten. Indeed, right now in California, there seems to be a new game developed called Slappin' Asian, as though there's some sport in going after Asian Americans right now in California. Fear seems to be gripping our community, and I don't want to be, and people say I'm being hyperbolic about it. The fact of the matter is I saw this poll the other day of Asian Americans and of people within the United States, and Asian Americans were unique in terms of they were asked, what do Americans think is the principal threat to their community right now? And for the vast majority of all Americans, there is one threat, and that is the COVID-19 virus. The fear of getting that virus was considered the number one concern of most Americans. But Asian Americans are uniquely different. It was not the virus. It was the fear of anti-Asian sentiment and racism and incidents posed against them. So think about it. In a time when we have this deadly virus that's afoot and all Americans is presumably dealing with it, Asian Americans have a greater threat. And the threat is not imposed by the virus. The threat is imposed by their neighbors and people on the street, their fellow Americans is their greatest fear. So think about that notion. Or think about the fact that in the Boston schools, you saw, for example, when they went back to school a couple of weeks ago, there was a poll done of parents. And Asian Americans were unique. About 85% of Asian American families and their students said that they did not want to go back to in-person schooling. And for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons was they were afraid of the bullying and the anti-racist activity that they would find in the schools. And I just saw a report today about an hour ago that said 60% of Asian Americans nationwide are preferred not to go back to school, partially because of anti-Asian sentiment. This is compared to 19% of the total population. So almost three times as many Asian Americans do not want to go back to school in person partially because of anti-Asian violence, compared to 19% of the general population. So there's a real fear about it. And I saw another figure that just saw about an hour ago that said 60% of Asian American women in the United States today claim that they have suffered in some respect anti-Asian incident leveled against them. 60% of Asian American women in the United States. This is not a small phenomenon. This is an important moment in our history. So Asian Americans have important roles to play in responding to the racial injustice and the moment in the United States. And let me end by saying this. To our Latino brothers and sisters, we Asian Americans know, for we have been the undesirable strangers at the border. We would be the first ones to have been excluded in 1882, and we have been called aliens ineligible for citizenship. To the undocumented, we can say that we Asian Americans know the term illegal immigrants, for in fact, was first coined for us as Asian Americans. We know because we've had paper sons. We know because my father, who was an undocumented immigrant, came to the United States during a period of time when no Asian Americans were allowed into the United States. And so he did as many of our Latino brothers did. He snuck across that Rio Grande border, and he came to the United States actually twice as an undocumented immigrant in the 1930s in the 1930s, most likely. And we know because about 1 million of the undocumented immigrants in the United States are in fact of Asian background. And we know because many of them are being deported, including Cambodian immigrants and youth, essentially who committed crimes just like stealing a album or something in high school or something. And now they're being deported back to Cambodia for their actions. So we know about the deportation regime against our citizens, our undocumented individuals. And to our Muslim brothers and sisters and Arab Americans, we know because we have been considered a yellow peril. We have been the victims of collective guilt. As I pointed out, for those who are placed in concentration camps in America, we know what it means to be held responsible for the acts of some of us who share our heritage but are not of us. So we know all of these factors, and therefore, to me, I think we ought to recognize something that's important. And in Ferguson, Missouri, there were people around in the police department and amongst the white people within Ferguson, Missouri, wearing these badges, and the badge says, "I am Darnell Wilson." Now, Darnell Wilson, who was Darnell Wilson? Darnell Wilson was a policeman who shot a young 18-year-old black kid named Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, a couple summers ago. And these people in the police department, so forth, wanted people to assert that they wanted to say that they had their identification and they wanted to support the policeman who shot him, Darnell Wilson. So I say to our Black brothers and sisters, and indeed for all of us, the beginning of understanding and the basis of solidarity and our attacks against persistent racism and debilitating inequities is when all of us, whether we're Black or yellow or brown or red or white, We can stand and stay in solidarity that I am Michael Brown. I am Trayvon Martin. I am Vincent Chin. I am Breonna Taylor. I am Ahmaud Arbery. I am Suncha Kim. I am not an illegal. I am not a terrorist. I am not a virus. I am not a yellow pearl. We Asian Americans are sick and tired of being scorned, of being spat upon, about being stabbed and shot at and being shoved. We are all somebody. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Watanabe. That's such a wonderful speech. And thank you for giving us this very concise but important historical review of the systematic exclusion, discrimination against Asian Americans. Race had played a very important role in shaping our lives, and it is remaining an important factor in our current life. And we are no longer invisible, however, and we will claim our voice, as you said. We will write our own stories, and we will ally with our brothers and sisters in the other racial minority groups. So now let's move on to our panel presentations. I would like to invite our three wonderful panelists to give a presentation. Each of them will give about 10 to 12 minutes of the presentation. And we will follow this order. So first, we will have State Representative Erica, who will introduce the legislation relative to anti-racism, equity, and justice in education, the main topic of today's discussion. And then Ms. Mai Du, one of the main community leaders initiating this legislation, will discuss her experience and the stories in the community that led to this legislation. We will then have Mr. Sam Hyun, chairperson of the Asian American Commission, share with us his stories and perspectives. So I will very briefly provide an introduction about each of our panelists' background. So State Representative Erica Weir Hoeven was born in Boston, Massachusetts. She earned a bachelor's degree from Wellesley College in 2010 and a master's degree from the University of Toulouse in 2014, as well as a master's degree from Harvard University Business School in 2019. Erica's career experience includes co-founding ACT on Math and working as a trainer and a workshop facilitator for the Massachusetts Teachers Association, a trainer for Math Alliance, the head of Digital and Data for Momentum, a national field organizer for the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign, and an antitrust economist. She has been associated with Emerge Massachusetts, Sunrise Movement Boston, Democratic Socialists of America Boston, Our Revolution Somerville, Progressive Massachusetts. And she represents Somerville, Massachusetts. Mr. Mai Du has been a community advocate and activist since her high school years in the early 1990s. As a youth leader, Mai took part in co-founding the Coalition for Asian Pacific American Youth. She earned a master's degree from Tufts in education, focusing on racial ethnic studies and school and community collaborations. She's the co-founder and a board member of the Greater Melbourne Asian American Community Coalition and the United States Dragon and Lion Dance Federation, board member of the South Cove Community Health Center, Asian Community Development Corporation, ACDC, and the Maria Drost Counseling Services. She's also the regional director of the United States Kosu or Kung Fu Federation. Currently, she operates and teaches at her own martial arts establishment for the Wan Nan Kung Fu and the Tai Chi Academy in both Melbourne and Quincy. And Mr. Sam Hyun, chairperson of the Asian American Commission. Aside from his recent appointment to the Asian American Commission as a commissioner, Sam had worked for Massachusetts House Speaker Robert Dino for the previous 4 years. Currently, he is pursuing his master's degree in public policy from Brandeis University's Heller School, while serving as the chair of social justice for the MPPSA. Sam also serves as the executive director for the Korean American Citizens League. He has previously spoken on a number of panels and been a keynote speaker to various groups on a wide range of issues. Sam has also spoken at several college and university undergraduate classes about politics and public service. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. And Erica, would you mind going first?
Thank you so much, Mr. Lee Song. Hello, everyone. My name is Erica Eiderhoven. I'm serving my first term as state representative of the 27th Middlesex District, and I want to start by expressing gratitude to the organizers of this event, as well as thank you so much to Professor Watanabe for your incredible work in political science and for sharing your story and your beautiful words, as well as gratitude to our fellow panelists and for everyone being here with us tonight. As well as all of the young people of color, our elders of color, and all of our community members who have been organizing vigorously through this pandemic. Truly, words cannot describe how much hope you all give me and nourish me every day to be building this intergenerational, interracial movement together, because this work that we do is about honoring generations that have come before us, and it is in service on centering the generations that will come after us. So thank you all so much. So I also wanted to take a moment to send out to you all love and solidarity, because this has been a very challenging and difficult year for our communities in so many ways. And particularly the past few months have been marked by trauma, but also revelation and deep reflection. And so I just wanted to send love out to anyone who is hurting, and that we are in this together. We are here to heal, organize, dismantle, and build together. So when Ben invited me to speak at the symposium on promoting Asian American cultural heritage and what we as a community must do to address the current historic moment we are living in with this surge of anti-Asian hate, one really can't separate the personal from the political, because this work is deeply personal. And anti-Asian racism is both about anti-Asian hate and Asian American erasure. And that erasure means that our humanity, our lived experiences, our pain, our ambitions to be whole citizens of this country is not even acknowledged. And it took a brutal murder and hate crime of unspeakable magnitude for America to pause and begin to see anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian racism. And so I think the most important way to talk about why this issue is so important and why this bill that I will share with you in a few minutes is so important is by sharing my personal experience and story. And also that it illuminates, why this is so important to us across generations. So I grew up here in Massachusetts, and my earliest memory as a child was playing outside of Red Barn, which was my preschool. And I remember I was playing and I saw my mom's white Buick pull up. And she rolled down her window smiling and she said, "Erica, ishoni kairo?" That means, "Erica, it's time to go home together." And I was so happy and so excited to see her. It's not every day that she was able to pick me up from school. And so I dropped the toy I was playing with and I ran over to hug her when a boy screamed loudly at my mom, imitating and mocking her English and pulling back the sides of his face to make fun of her eyes. And I froze. And I don't remember this part, but my mom told me very recently that in that moment at 4 years old, when we got in the car, I consoled her and told her it's going to be okay and that it's okay she doesn't speak English like me. So from a young age, we are taught that to survive white supremacy, you assimilate. You assimilate in school, you work hard, you don't speak up, and you fit in this disgustingly narrow mold. And often we're taught to laugh it off and smile when someone says something like, "It's not fair. You're only good at math because you're Asian." You ignore it when a classmate tells you that their grandparents don't want you at their house because you're Japanese. You work hard and hope that the next generation won't have to deal with this, only to realize that our youth and our elders are getting attacked for spreading the China virus that's perpetuated by none other than our president. And there have been over 3,800 incidents of hate crimes reported last year, twice as many incidents reported by women than men. And we know that this is a gross underreporting. And that is all to say that my story is not unique. And much of the research shows that young people experience racism and develop a racial identity at an incredibly young age, between the ages of 3 to 6 years old. And I learned recently that at this age, your frontal lobe is not yet developed. And that is where your frontal lobe is where your personality and critical thinking is. And that is developing and unfolding at that age. So what happens is that young people don't have the words to describe what is happening to them, but they truly and rawly feel racism, right? And the sense of racism is felt. And as parents and caregivers and educators and anyone who cares for young people, we witness this firsthand. And I remember this coming out over and over again throughout our testimony during the Asian American Commission held earlier this last month. And so that is why introducing this bill was so important to me, because it crosses our experiences of generations. It's calling for structural and systematic change, starting in our public schools, starting with our youth. And so I'm excited to share with you all this bill that I've introduced, an act relative to anti-racism, equity, and justice in education, which I introduced in partnership with Representative NECAA Legardo and Senator Jason Lewis, who is also the chair of the Education Committee in the Joint Education Committee in the State House. And this bill will set up a commission for anti-racism and equity in education. And I want to share with you some of the things that this commission will be tasked with. It is a commission that will both develop curriculum materials with a social justice perspective of dismantling racism, and to advise the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And just to share with everyone, that is the governing department that governs our public schools and the policies that our public schools operate under. So they'd be advising them on improving the history and social sciences framework in our schools. They'll also ensure, this is a very key part, which is to ensure that ethnic studies, racial justice, decolonizing history, and unlearning racism is taught at all grade levels, using a critical approach and pedagogy that is age appropriate. And I also want to share that those are kind of the two highlights, but the commission will also handle systemic changes in our public education. And I want to be very clear about what I mean by systemic, because many people have asked me, in what ways does white supremacy show up in schools? And my answer to that is, where does it not show up, right? And we see this in a white-centric curriculum is really the most explicit and identifiable way it shows up. But it's much deeper than that, because of course it shows up in our curriculum both explicitly and implicitly, but it also shows up in how we do public education, right? And it shows up in our recruitment of educators, in hiring, in what kind of questions that educators are asked. It shows up in teacher evaluation. And then if you dig even a level deeper than that, right, it shows up in teacher ed programs, right? What are the mandatory courses? What are which education theorists are we learning from, right? What courses are required in these teacher ed programs? Do they include ethnic studies or AAPI history or Black history, Latinx history, or Indigenous history, right? So when you combine that structure and the systemic nature of dismantling white supremacy in public schools, and you combine that with standardized tests, right? State standards that are not informed with anti-racism, it's an entire system that does not center on BIPOC students and BIPOC youth's history or their identities. And so that's why a really key part of this commission's mission is to also tackle the entire system, which includes curriculum, as well as access for educators, teachers, school counselors to have access to professional development that fosters equitable, inclusive curriculum and pedagogy and practices that support racial justice. It is also, the commission will be tasked with ensuring equity in MTEL, which is the educator's licensure exam, and ensuring that both what is its testing, right, as well as how is this serve as a racialized barrier for educators of color. The commission will also be advised or will be advising the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education on how to best support and promote efforts to increase, support, and retain educators of color in our public school workforce, because retention is also a really key part of this. And I also want to highlight two other parts of this bill that was sort of a must-have when we were working on this bill, which is one, that it comes with funding through a grant program to issue to school districts. And for me, as an economist, as an organizer, as a community activist, for me, budgets are moral documents, right? If there isn't funding, there isn't resources. And if there isn't resources, then there isn't commitment. And we are asking for a commitment by the state. We're asking for a commitment to anti-racism in our public education. So that's a key part, is around the funding. And then the second key part is around who is on this commission. Who is seated on this commission determines what voices are going to be shaping, right, this ongoing systemic work. Because this is not a one-shot deal. This is something that we are going to continue to work on and develop and change over the years, right? This is not something that's going to change overnight. And so it was so critical that in this bill, we outlined very clearly that this commission will be staffed or will be seated by BIPOC-led, with representatives from BIPOC-led community organizations and advocacy groups, by teachers unions, by the Association of Superintendents and the Association of School Committees, as well as the collaborative of Asian American, Native American, Latino, and African American Institutes of University of Massachusetts, Boston, as well as ACLU, faith groups, and parent representatives, as well as a representative from the Massachusetts Commission on LGBTQ Youth. And I share all that because I think those voices are so important, because this work needs to be a work of a broad coalition, right? An interracial, intergenerational coalition that reaches across all parts of the system that is working together. If we are going to dismantle this system, we need to work with all the various stakeholders of this system. And so I think it's just really key that this bill, both in terms of identifying who is on this commission, is centered on the voices of community organizations and BIPOC coalitions. And I think it's one piece that I want to share as well, and I want to then pass it over to Maiju, is that, I'm very proud to share that this bill has come before the legislature through the leadership of community organizing. It's come through and was drafted by building BIPOC coalitions, by drawing from the genius and creativity of BIPOC educators and advocacy groups, and most importantly, from the creativity and genius of BIPOC youth-led organizing. And so with that, I'm very excited and honored to pass the baton over to Maiju, who is a fierce community organizer and dear friend, and she has been leading on this incredible work. So thank you all so much for being in community with us, and I'll pass it over to Maiju.
Thanks, Erica, for the intro, and want to also echo the gratitude for the organizers of this event to bring voices and also uplift our history and our lived experiences as an Asian American community, celebrate our heritage. I also would like to say that it's so homecoming to hear from Dr. Paul Watanabe to speak about the history, but also hearing him again speaking now as a co-panelist. It was years ago, Dr. Watanabe, when I was a high school student, as a youth leader for the Coalition for Asian Pacific American Youth, and Paul was one of the very important adult leaders to have made that coalition a reality for many of the youth across Asian Pacific American youth across the state to come together and to be seen and be visible. And so he has been doing this work for many, many, many years. And that was the early 90s. And for myself to be now speaking and celebrating Asian Pacific American Heritage Month together and doing this work together again, it's so heartwarming and so humbling and honoring. But the reason I bring this up is because I started out as a youth who was very much in need of being seen, heard, and whose experiences in school and history was not taught or included. Probably only the time when, teachers looked towards me was when they talked about the Vietnam War, and then they looked towards me as if like I have something to talk about or to share, and that was it. I was also a young person that got statements like "go back to your country" thrown at me frequently, and I was also a student that or young person that really felt that I had to be submissive and quiet in school because that was what was expected, and that I had to be good in math because that was the stereotype. And so being a part of the experience of organizing as a young person, feeling empowered, having adult community leaders like Dr. Paul Watanabe and those his colleagues, Dr. Peter Kiang and Dr. Andrew Leong, and so many who are now leaders and mentors to leaders in the Greater Boston area, community organizations and whatnot. I was able to feel that I could do something about it. And I have been doing that work and extending that work throughout my whole college years as well as thereafter. And so I share this because right now with the work of building the coalition, it has been very intentional by the coalition and by myself personally to ensure that the youth are at the forefront and their voices are being centered, because that was how I got started. And if I got started and it took this many years and we're still not moving the needle too much, then we need to get even more young people on board to ensure that the work continues and that the content of the bill that Erica is filing and leading will actually make a difference, because it is now going to be in the education system. It's gonna dismantle racism, decolonize the curriculum. So I want to take this opportunity to really thank those who came before me, and personally thank Paul here for doing this work for so many years and continuing to do the work, continue to educate and continue to make us be visible. The bill itself, like Erica has shared, is quite unique, and we're quite proud of it as a very diverse and united coalition. It comes from all communities of color. Of course, the Asian AAPI community here, many represented by the young people. Also comes from the Latinx community, and the forefront was Sociedad Latina community organization. And the NAACP, Boston, North American, North American Indian Center of Boston to represent the indigenous community, diversifying our narrative, representing our youth leaders and their voices. These are students from across the state who want their curriculum to be more diversified, the content in the classrooms to reflect their lived experiences and uplift their family's history, their community's history, and more, and so much more. So many more organizations, and in the center of it all, like I said, have been young people. And it has been my honor and my privilege, and they have inspired me so much to keep going. And Dr. Paul Watanabe has been a part of this coalition, coming in with the Canala Institute at UMass Boston to support the the language of the bill before it filed and finalized the language and whatnot until it formally filed. So UMass Boston, Harvard University, Harvard Graduate School of Education, and many other folks, Boston Teachers Union, educators, parents, students. It has been a very, very, in fact, precious experience of community organizing, one that has heightened solidarity building work in my eyes, simply because the time should have been yesterday, should have been decades ago, centuries ago, where we hold the American system accountable to the white supremacist structure that has been suppressing and marginalizing communities of color. I don't have to repeat. Paul has already, shared that history, and still, like you said an hour ago, Asian American students are not feeling ready to go back to school simply because, not because of COVID, but because of the fear for their lives, the fear of violence. And so I can't stress enough the importance of all of us needing to come together to support this bill. When I say all of us, of course, I have been so grateful for the organizers here, NECAA, who and others who have been, leading their effort to organize in their respective communities and branching out. We literally just had an event two nights ago, sharing and getting a lot of people on board, school committees, superintendents, and legislators on board. So everybody's doing their part, but we need to do more, and we need to really recognize that this is a time where solidarity is more important than ever before. We are now going for a bill that has a lot of hope. Erica has shared that this came from the community. It came from a coalition. And I remember talking to her before filing, and Erica, you remember this, that you kept saying, this is so important. This is so heartwarming because it comes from the community. And for the first time, or, for a long time, the community can really drive the language and drive, the demands, and ask legislators to agree to this instead of the other way around. And I think that, we have a lot to thank the young people for, because they have been a force. But like I said, we have to continue to build solidarity. We have to continue to see ourselves as a bigger part of the solution, and to create this change in their education system. The fact that Senator Lewis is the co-chair of the Joint Committee on Education is huge, to give us a lot of hope to move this bill forward. But like, Erica has said, it's going to be about funding. It's going to be about making sure that there's going to be money behind supporting this coalition, this commission that will be established for its operation, as well as the trust fund that it calls for to disseminate fundings and programmings that will link the best practices that are on the ground by community organizations, grassroots organizations, by higher ed institutions that are doing the research and doing the practices as well, and they are also the ones who are producing the educators, and so there's and to hold DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, accountable, as well as to see that they can also be partners to this work. So in some ways, we're balancing the the oversight to what DESE is doing, but at the same time inviting collaborative relationships and efforts so that they see that this both the commission and the coalition are positive assets. Like we're going to be assets to the work of DESE, and not here to push them around or ask them to do something that as if they're not doing it at all. We know that in 2018 there was a a reform to the Massachusetts teacher standards and framework, but that was not enough to decolonize the curriculum. There were efforts, but not enough. And so this commission and the charges for what it's going to do that was described in detail by Erica, it's going to be so key to ensuring that, that the changes that we're hoping to see will happen. And all this, as an Asian American, I see it coming really close to home for me. Like I said, as an Asian American youth, I was not seen in the curriculum. In fact, I was asked to teach certain things when it comes down to Asian American topics, and that was not the way that teachers should be teaching. And it's a very similar experiences for many of our Asian American students still today. And so I guess I don't have to say much more because, there has been a lot of buy-in from this community here, from the organizers that are putting this bill in the forefront of this symposium and for this discussion. So I don't want to say any more other than that I would like to now give voice to the youth leaders who have been a part of this. And so I'm going to bring up some slides. A lot of them are going through APs, and also the seniors are having their last week of schoolwork, so they cannot join. But there are slides that they have created to make presentations from the youth perspective. So I would like to share so that you actually hear it from them. So I'm going to do very quickly to give them voice and also to respect and honor their work. Okay, so let me see. There you go. This is all their graphics. They created this. They call themselves Massachusetts Care and Education, careforyouth.ma. And CARE means Commission on Anti-Racism in Education. Sorry, I'm going to just put this on presentation. Oh, I'll just do this then. Sorry. This is the young people talking. So who are we? Youth across Massachusetts fighting for a mass care bill to diversify our curriculum and increase racial equity in education. And they truly, this is their words. This is their concepts. First, they think that it's very important to connect to build momentum for the bill, and through social media and general outreach. And so they're, as soon as school ends, they're going to ramp up the social media presence. They're already building the foundation, the background work for all this with their tech skills. And then they want to educate people about the importance of the diverse narratives and perspectives and civics. And then they want to advocate so that they want to be at the forefront to be making this bill a reality. And I had already shared the different organizations. So the young people, you have to be impressed by this, because the young people really wanted to be very clear about what it means to be anti-racist and equitable and just. So I really want to give light to this because, according to their definition, they see it as recognizing for anti-racism is recognizing our own privileges within a racist society and understanding how policy upholds white supremacy and confronting racism head on. They want to also define ethnic studies. And so it's the study of race, ethnicity, and indigeneity, focusing on the experience of BIPOC in the US, analyze how power and oppression, as well as the construct of race and racism impact our lives. They define equity as providing additional resources to underserved groups to yield. And for justice, they define it as implementing systemic changes to create an equitable system for all. And because the bill has such big language, right? Anti-racism, equity, justice, we got to be very clear as to what we're talking about. And the young people say we need to be clear for ourselves when we go out and talk about it. So I want to share that. Also, this is a great image right here to share. So you can see the notes because I'm not in. So this is all the different youth doing the work. So there are notes beside there and asking questions and all that. But so inequity, as you can see, is described here with more apples on one side, and then equality is the same height for the ladder, but one side has more apples than the other. And then equity is when the ladder is higher on the side that has less apples, so that the child here on the side with less resources can actually reach it. And then justice is when there's actually a scaffold to push the tree so that it's more balanced, and so all the apples can be equally distributed. So it's just so heartwarming to see the thought process behind the young people's work. And recently, and this is a good transition to chairperson of the Asian American Commission. Recently, the Asian American youth leaders presented at the AAC deliberation on the specific bills. So they actually tied their own personal experience with the current experience of the rise of anti-Asian hate incidents and police brutality to the importance of this bill. So I just want to make sure that this is what we see from the young people and hear from them as well. Lastly, the last two images that I want to share is that this is what they're seeing in school: Eurocentrism, books like Hamlet and To Kill a Mockingbird, where it's a white savior outlook and it's filtered. And then there's also tokenization of Huckleberry Finn and the Joy Luck Club, which is like, there are so many more options of books that can be used in school right now, but it's still, many teachers are still using the Joy Luck Club, which is like decades ago. I was reading that book when I was in school. And alternative textbooks and teaching materials that they see that can be used are things like, Lies My Teachers Told Me and many more other books. And so this is why the young people feel it is so important to decolonize the curriculum and to have this bill be passed, because it is not just so important for our adult communities, Asian American communities, to have this bill be passed, as described by Erica and the historical context by Dr. Watanabe, but for the young people, it is real for them. It is real that they get to learn ways that will celebrate their lived history, their local history, contextualize, their communities to see it in the curriculum. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Chairperson Sam Hung, who heard from the youth recently, and also under his leadership, the commission has strongly endorsed the bill. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mai. And you're absolutely correct that, I think after hearing from the community and especially specifically the young people, it was very obvious which position the commission should take. And I'm proud to say that we have very strongly stood behind this bill, and it's something that I think is critically important. I think also just to give a couple of corrections with the introduction, that's old. We do have to update the bio on the commission website. I am a public policy and also MBA student as well, and I'm no longer with KACL, although they're in great hands with their new executive director, and I am part of the Hate is Virus team. I think before I start, I just want to first of all thank everyone who has spoken today thus far. I really want to thank the NECAA for bringing this panel together and this community so that we can hear and really start to understand legislation, right? And because when you look at legislation, it can be really daunting when you first look at it. There's a lot of really legal language, and the way that the policy is written, if English isn't your first language, it's going to feel very intimidating to understand. But when you're able to have people who are experts and understand the bill inside out, just like Representative Eiderhoven and Dr. Watanabe, to be able to explain it in more layman's terms so that people can understand, I think is critical. The second thing I really wanted to highlight is that, just a few days ago was the birthday of Vincent Chin. It's really important that we honor that, and as a someone who was brutally murdered, but also, I think in the spirit of ethnic studies, I believe every student and child and person in this country should know that name, and the significance of Vincent Chin to not just the Asian American community, not just the Chinese American community, but I think to from all people around the world of the brutality that violence can inflict on people. Secondly, just yesterday was the birthday of Yuri Kochiyama, who is one of our greatest fighters and advocates and leaders. And it's critical that again, just like Vincent Chin, everyone should know Yuri Kochiyama's name. So I just wanted to name those two first. As I go into what I'm about to speak about, I was recently asked in an interview, what it's like to be in a position of leadership in this time and what it means to me. And so for me, I think I'm trying to weigh all the voices within our community and make sure that everybody feels seen, feels safe and valued, and also trying to understand that everyone is at a different place. And so how do we make sure that we move forward collectively without leaving anybody behind? How are we navigating that and capturing everyone's perspectives, their feelings, which is so difficult, right? And I think we all know it's necessary if we're going to be intentional about including the entire community. And one of the common concerns within our community is the overall lack of concern or apathy, not just of those outside of the Asian American AAPI community, but also from within. There is that tension between folks like, it's too big of a problem, or I have other things to be concerned about, which are valid in their own ways, but that is an overall concern. And so how do we go from apathy to empathy to transformation? And so how do we get people who may not have the frameworks to understand the perspective of our community, or have the frameworks of understanding critical race theory, or have the frameworks of understanding racial and social justice? How do we get folks within our community, outside of our community, to learn those frameworks in a way that we go away from such academic terms, but in a way that people are understanding and believe it and live it? And so also, how do we get Americans who have learned everything from a Western point of view to be able to understand our community who is coming from very much an Eastern point of view? And so the way that we see and understand and know the world is from two completely different perspectives. So how do we start to get people to understand both viewpoints? And that, as much as we celebrate and honor our uniqueness and differences, that we also don't use it as a way to create a wedge between us. Which then takes me to my next point, which is that I believe that Asian Americans are at a unique and at times uncomfortable intersection in this country. We're often used as a wedge to divide communities of color. When you look at the way that the Yellow Peril was created, and then you see the narrative of the perpetual foreigner, then you see how that has all led up to the model minority myth, and how we have been weaponized against other communities of color, but also having to understand that maybe not all members of our community quite understand that. And so having some grace in explaining and welcoming people in to be able to, again, see and understand. And so I also think that our experience and our pain, and why this piece of legislation is so critical, and including ethnic studies into the pedagogy of the curriculums across the country and not just as Commonwealth, is that our pain and our experience have been totally erased, or we're gaslit that it doesn't happen. And that our achievements have been erased from history books, so our children aren't growing up to be able to be proud of themselves, of our community's accomplishments, but others are also ignorant to our community. And so you hear a lot of language being used, a lot of rhetoric being used that's simply not true, but it's hard to dismantle that when there's no education and an actual accurate depiction of our community being put out there in the mainstream, but also within personal conversations. So this is why it's critical that we're accurately understood, right? That we pass critical legislation like ethnic study legislation, data disaggregation, appropriate funding for language justice. I mean, that we continue to get involved. But that I just want this to be clear, because I think that this is a narrative that I continue to see within our community that is troubling to me, that we tend to stop at fighting just for representation. To me, representation is just the beginning. And that being heard is the bare minimum, that being invited to the table is not enough, that we must demand that we are respected, valued, and loved. So that I encourage, if not challenge, our community to have these uncomfortable conversations, to do the difficult work, and continue to build unity that we desperately need, and that we are a part of the movement to make America a country that is truly equitable for all people. That we have to be a part of a future that fights for justice and builds the America we deserve. And so I'll just kind of also end that, in my research, to try to find policy solutions for our community, and oftentimes it's difficult to actually do that research because the data isn't available. So when when it's being taught, when research and public policy is being taught, even at a school that is predicated on social justice, at the Heller School, where we have Dr. Anita Hill, Dr. Luther King has come through. We have some of the most prominent social justice advocates come through the Heller School. We're often using data sets that don't include the Asian American community at all. And so you're inherently teaching public policy students who are going to be going into and creating these solutions and creating laws and analyzing, researching, and advocating to not look at data and fight to make sure that all people are included, that our community, our people are included. And so that's why data is so critical. And I understand that that can be a controversial topic within our community. And I think it's important that we talk about that, but also that one thing that I think we can all agree upon is the fact that our stories, our people, our community deserve to be heard, deserve to be valued, and are an integral part of the community. So with that, I know that folks want to ask questions and probably have a lot to say. So I'll end it there. But I really appreciate giving me the space and creating this conversation today.
Thank you very much, Sam. And thanks to everyone. I know that we're a little bit behind the schedule, but I also think it's important because there are so many rich stories, so many important perspectives to be shared, to be heard. So I think we'll be fine. And especially thank you everyone for sharing such touching personal stories and also giving us the very important background information, the rationale, the need for this legislation, and also its significance and the actions that need to be taken. So now I would like to, in fact, directly open the floor for our audience. And we do have a few questions already raised here. So maybe for the rest of the audience, feel free to type in your question in the chat. But let's focus on the questions already raised here first. I think Vivian Chen raised several questions. Vivian, are you here? Do you want to ask your questions yourself?
Really quickly, I just want to recognize that one of our commissioners has joined us, Megha Prasad. So Commissioner Prasad is here, and I just wanted to recognize her very quickly. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks for joining us. So, so maybe I would just put the question here. I think our panelists can already say this, right? So 3 different aspects. The first one is about, please speak to the role of white supremacy in the treatment of Asian Americans in American history. I think Professor Watanabe's speech already covered a lot of this, but feel free to give us more thoughts on this particular question.
Excuse me, in the interest of time, I asked a lot of questions, but let me just focus on 2 particular questions.
That's great.
One is about the budget mechanism for the funding mechanism for the commission, the work of the commission. Will it require annual appropriation from the General Assembly?
That's a great question, Vivian. Thank you for asking that. So at the moment, the way it's set up is that we will be setting up a trust fund that will, be essentially we're asking the state to be putting funding towards that. It's something that we don't define a specific amount in the bill because it is something that we want it to be growing over time, but it will involve needing to get appropriation at the first step. My goal is that we will get it to a point where we don't need to be asking every year, right, to replenish it, but it is something that to get started, that is one step that we'll have to go through. But there is a fund that will both be asking the state to be funding as well as donations, but really primarily our goal is that we want to make sure that the state is providing that funding and that funding becomes larger and stable as we move forward.
And if I may ask a second question, it has to do with potential opposition to this legislation. I'm very impressed and proud of the fact that the legislative language is very unabashedly anti-racist. It's the language is proud and it really shines a light on really dark corners of American history that many people continue not to want to face. And given the opposition to the very vanilla data desegregation bill that has been successful over what, a 2-year period? I was wondering if, that same group and others may also gather to oppose this legislation. And if opposition does appear, what's your thinking? What's our strategy to overcome that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very important question. I think with any piece of legislation, right, that we introduce, the first question is who is in support, and then the second question is who is in opposition, and what are we going to be dealing with. And so I think for this bill so far, my experience we have not encountered opposition yet. I have gotten opposition on other bills. So I will say that even as a first-year legislator, I have gotten opposition on a number of my bills so far, but this one has not been one of them. And I think I certainly think we want to be, prepared, but I think one piece that we made sure to be clear was that, we're talking about the issue of anti-racism in the bill very explicitly. We did not want to compromise on that because I think this is part of a whole national reckoning and a global reckoning in some ways. And so I think that this is something, at least within the State House itself, we have also not had opposition yet, because I think there has been a deep understanding, at least from the legislators' point of view, that this is a serious issue we need to be talking about, and it's not going away. It's not something that we can pass one bill for and move on. And so that's also another piece that's, I think, also very important, is there opposition even within the State House, and that is also something we have not encountered yet. But I think that, it's always important to be prepared and to understand those dynamics. But I also want to share that's just my quick little sort of response to that. I'm kind of curious, love to hear from my fellow panelists too, if they have, what your thoughts are to Vivian's questions.
Yeah, I've actually, this is actually really interesting because as a commission, we've also supported data segregation, and that was a very different conversation that we have with members of the public, where we got a lot of strong opposition. And I remember even in my time at the State House that this was, to me as a public policy, someone who's, studies public policy and has worked in public policy, and, doing research, like, to me, data desegregation is critical. But I also understand and have spent a lot of time listening to those members of our community who feel very uncomfortable and are fearful, and why that is. And so I think it's important that we recognize that and don't look at it as a point of like trying to defeat them, so to speak, but actually trying to have a conversation to come to some sort of understanding. Mm-hmm. On the flip side of that, though, in a more encouraging note, is that in that same vein, I've had conversations with those same folks, and they've expressed a lot of enthusiasm of ethnic studies bill. Mm-hmm. And so while we had a very spirited and challenging and difficult conversation surrounding one bill, we then came and had a very encouraging and happy and exciting conversation surrounding ethnic studies. And so we were like, we are at the end of the day family, and family doesn't always agree, but when we do, we can find that commonality and make sure that we are moving forward in the aspects that we can, instead of just saying, oh, you know what, I disagree with you here, therefore you are my mortal enemy. I think that is, to me, I think it's not a way that any leader should behave, but instead finding ways to push our community forward in the avenues that we can. So, I just want to frame it as not trying to defeat folks who disagree with us, but instead trying to get to an understanding so that we can move forward together.
Well, I would say that, of course, there's opposition to this sort of thing, because that's what we're talking about. That's why we're having to have ethnic studies. We're doing this in a context when we're talking about people attacking Asian Americans, and these are the kind of people who believe that Asian Americans don't belong. So the racist element in American society is pretty strong and pretty valid in their mind. And we have a president of the United States, for example, who in fact stated very clearly in the federal government, for example, ethnic training, utilizing terms like diversity training and ethnic training, would be disallowed. And this is a president who is very popular among certain people in the United States. So assuredly, yes, there is opposition to these things. There's a battle in many states against ethnic studies, and successfully so in many jurisdictions across the country. So sure, there's opposition, and whether it will get organized or so, that's the value of ourselves making these arguments and getting the support broadly for one position, our position, which we think is the reasonable one. But there's not the fact that I think a position is reasonable is maybe enough reason for somebody to want to oppose it in a big way. And I think it's going to occur. And so even within the Asian American community, there is opposition in the Illinois legislation from amongst the Asian American community in terms of trying to get Asian American studies in the school system. So yes, there is opposition, and we're going to have to deal with that opposition, and hopefully the views that we're suggesting here will prevail in the end. But sure there is, and we're going to have to deal with it, and we're realistic about that.
So I'm very happy to hear from Erica that, you know, so far there has not been opposition that she has experienced and encountered. It has been very encouraging that, you know, Senator Lewis has been forwarding a lot of contacts and organizations that have learned about the bill and wanted to support it to the coalition, and for them to learn more about the bill and how they can support. So far it has been very, very encouraging. For example, I shared a couple of nights ago that the NAACP nationally is aware of this bill and is in the process of giving the state level endorsement. They have been very cautious about putting their NAACP name on various bills, particularly that just happened with the police brutality, police accountability bill. And so our colleague who has been their NAACP rep has been very cautious about the name that has been listed on the bill language itself. But I just heard from him that it seems like it probably will be going through very soon. So it's very, very encouraging, even internally as well as externally. But one thing that I would like to say is that due to the reckoning right now, and also and I say this all the time, that how it can be seen as very sexy to support this bill, you know, with the current discourse. The passing of the bill itself, what you know, Senator Lewis and also Rep. Stephen Altrino as vice chair of the committee on the House side, there's a lot of people signing on to say that they support. My concern is more that, you know, going forward, will there be money that will give teeth to the bill itself?
Mm-hmm.
I think that, you know, given the current time, folks may not come out very blatantly to oppose it. They may pass it, but then it may just be another commission that doesn't have a lot of power. So it comes down to the community continuing to push after the bill gets passed, and to keep a very close oversight in terms of, you know, the budget process that Vivian asked about. You know, how are we going to ensure that the money will channel directly to the commission, and that it becomes a very, you know, vibrant and powerful living body to create all the change, all the positive impacts that we hope for the bill to be able to do. So and that's the part that, you know, I think that we need to, you know, keep our vision for the long run, and not just the bill itself and this session. I think I from the sense of how, you know, folks have been contacting the coalition and talking about the bill, from legislators to community organizations to statewide organizations, they may not outright oppose it, but I think the fight is really where the dollars are at for later on. So I think we need to continue to build this momentum even after the session, and I hope we can.
Yeah, can I say that Vivian's sensibility in asking that question was exactly right, and that is to say, it's easy to create something, but as Representative Erica points out, it's a moral document in terms of the budget, and unless you provide state money, public money behind it, you can create legislation that allows a particular entity to raise money privately to support a public function, but that's not going to sustain it in the end. It's a little bit like when we created the Asian American Commission as an official state agency. It took 10 or 15 years to even get any support from the state budget to support the Asian American Commission itself. So to me, that Vivian's sensibilities, as I understand it, are right on. She is very suspicious of something getting created where one has the right to fundraise for it rather than to put public money behind it. And I think she's right about that. If that was the intent of her question, I think she's absolutely right about that.
And if I may add, I know Rep. Erica knows this as well, that we're in conversation with Senator Chang Diaz right now to see if this bill will be referenced as one of the recipients of the compulsory contribution for the diversity board bill, which is that those, I believe they're corporate boards. I'm not sure if it's just restricted to corporate, but boards that are not diverse enough or comprised of only white men are required to contribute a certain. I don't know the specific of that bill, but that is a bill that is presented by Senator Sonia Chang Diaz, and we are in the process of scheduling a meeting to ensure that our bill, the commission, will be referenced in that bill for the money to come to the commission's work as well.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to just, also add that, like, I think sometimes folks, especially community members, want one piece of legislation to be the end all be all to save our community, so to speak, right? Like, for instance, when President Biden today signed the Stop Asian Hate bill, like, great that there are some community allocated funds going towards community organizations and mutual aid, but there's also some aspects of the bill that members of our community are distinctly concerned about. And so I think it's important to recognize that, but also that, like, it's not just one bill, but it's like, and it's not just members of Congress or governor, whatever, saying stop Asian hate, right? But it's like, where is the action that follows? And that's going to be dependent on whether or not our community stays engaged, whether our community continues to show up, whether we vote, whether we organize. And it's going to be a collective movement that we're going to have to come together. And if we're being totally frank, within our community, we don't have solidarity. And I've done not just with the Asian American Commission, but I think with the work I've tried to do nationally to bring our community together, we'll at times there'll be some hope, and then something will happen, and then everything falls apart. And I think until we have that honest conversation of recognizing that there are divisions within our community, whether they are due to geopolitics, whether they are due to differences of political belief, whether that's due to religion, religious affiliation, or even just a personal gripe against somebody. But it's those conversations of recognition that these divisions exist. And then, okay, now that we've pinpointed it, where do we go from here? Because every single time we try to advocate for something, if we don't actually show up in strong numbers, if we aren't coming unified, the members, the politicians and the people who have power aren't going to listen to us because they have no reason to. If our community is saying one thing, and all of a sudden another other half of our community is saying something completely different, they're not incentivized to actually listen. And so I think we have to have these really challenging conversations, and look in the mirror and have that solidarity building that is so critical. These types of bills having real teeth and real impact on our community.
Thank you for all the great clarifications and also the optimistic, encouraging comments. And thank you, Vivian, for the questions. I do know that we are now 11 minutes passing 9. And as I put in the chat, please feel free, if you have other obligations, feel free to leave. But I guess we have 1 or 2 more questions here. So if people don't mind, we can have still informal conversation for another 5 to 10 minutes, if that's fine to everyone here. All right. So I think El Niang, who raised hand earlier, are you still there? Okay, maybe not, but Hannah Ni did ask a question here about a more specific issue. What will be the strategies of funding and the collaborations among school districts to support Asian American curriculum? Any comments from our panelists?
I think for the Boston Teachers Union, there has been an effort that has been that has seen some successes. It's been going on for the last, I believe, 2 to 3 years, where educators and school leaders came together and established an Ethnic Studies Now campaign. I think this school year, they actually have a full-time staff that is, from that work, they actually created model curriculums and frameworks for teaching ethnic studies in Boston Public Schools, and they have started piloting. So, and this group of organizers have been a part of the coalition's work from the start. But if we don't have something like this bill, it's going to come down to, local efforts similar to the BTU, where they have to work so hard and so long and really fight for a small budget within the whole district to even hire one full staff. I believe they were asking for $300,000 for the school year to implement the Ethnic Studies Now campaign. And I think they got half of that, and that was kind of a celebration. That's nothing for a whole school district. But they made it work, and they're piloting right now. So it really comes down, I believe, in my very, very limited experience and perspective here, that it really comes down to concurrent to supporting this bill and getting this passed, and eventually building a very strong commission, care commission. Local organizers should continue to push the school districts, the school committee, the superintendents, student voices are very important. I know at Malden, there's a group of student leaders called Students for Racial Equity, and they've been pushing to diversify the curriculum as well. So there's just been a lot going on, but we have to do it concurrently. It's both, local as well as this bill.
Well, let me say that a mandate without proper training and money behind that training is a mandate which I would not support. So when the original idea was put forward to simply have an ethnic studies requirement, I said very early on that I thought without training, I thought it could be a disaster. Mm-hmm. School systems may just simply say, Fred, you go and teach ethnic studies, or you go and teach the Indigenous American experience, although Fred may not know anything about it, and Fred may be a wonderful person, but Fred isn't trained to teach so. And I thought that'd be a disaster. And that's why I think it's not even something that's a choice. You got to mandate that there be proper training, and that should be probably, and it makes sense to not do so only within a district framework, particularly small districts. It should be shared across districts and across the system. I think that there's an economy about that, and it makes it reasonable, and there's a seriousness about that too. So without that kind of training, without that kind of background, without that kind of preparation, I think it could be a disaster, and it's proven to be a disaster in many places without it. So that's a critical part of the legislation. It's a precursor to actually going into the classroom and trying to be responsible for teaching this very important stuff. And on the point again about funding, if you think about it, I'm thinking about, for example, what if we said that to teach algebra, you had to raise the money yourself privately? Everybody would think that's absurd, but in some ways, to be able to teach ethnic studies, we're being asked in some respects to be able to raise money privately, to be able to train teachers and be able to offer it in schools. That's an absurd proposition. I think the schools themselves and the system, the public system at the state level and at the district levels, must be behind this initiative, just like they'd be behind the teaching of algebra or math or geometry or English or any other critical subject matter. That's what we're talking about. It's as critical as teaching English, as teaching American history, as teaching math, this focus that we're talking about. It's not an add-on.
Thank you, Paul, for bringing that up. And I want to actually add the context that it was actually both many members at the UMass Boston Canal Institute, as well as other professors and the Boston Teachers Union folks who said that they did not want to see a mandate from the start. And hence we went with the route of establishing a standing commission to ensure that the work is very intentional. We didn't want this to be, number one, co-opted, but two, it becomes a checkbox for school districts and certain schools to kind of say, yep, we have, somebody teaching ethnic studies already, that's all set, and then now next. And it's actually, it can become very detrimental to students taking ethnic studies and think that this is what it is, and never, respect it and embrace it further. So even at the Boston Teachers Union, like I said, it has been 2 to 3 years that they've been doing this work, and they want to scale it out very slowly. So they're piloting, and hence with the bill, our initial language was to actually start out with gateway cities, to have some school districts implement first, and then keep building capacity while we do more Teachers Institute and create more content for model curriculums and more. So this is why we want a commission and not a mandate. And we want this work to be very, very intentional with all those experts at the table to guide this process to create resources and power to build a very strong foundation for the work to go for the years to come.
I wanted to address, those are questions that I thought was really critical in here that came up, and it came from Helen Lee, and it was like, what are the suggestions in terms of preventing kids, parents, families from becoming victims of bias or microaggressions? Because even if this bill is implemented, it's going to take time for people to unlearn and then relearn the frameworks that we're trying to teach here of our community. And for me, I think this is why bystander intervention and bystander training is really critical. I think that's something that we need to be teaching our children, teaching teachers, is that, when there was a study that was done that I believe it was 76% of people, when someone intervened and somebody stood up for them, that the situation got better and that it improved. And that was how they said that either they felt like violence was prevented or they felt like the aggression was mitigated. But the sad part about that is that only 25% of people have said that somebody stood up for them. And how many members of our community can say that we've remembered when someone was accosting us verbally or trying to assault us, and everyone just stood there and no one said anything. And so I think it's just teaching our children, that it is okay and that you should stand up for yourself. And that when they come home and they tell you about the story of what happened to them, that you validate their pain, that we don't question it or ask too many, but really just first of all, make them feel like that what happened to them is not okay, and that they're not weak, or they're not bad, or they're not, that they shouldn't feel ashamed that it happened to them, because it's not their fault, that they shouldn't be bearing the responsibility and the weight of what someone did to them. But instead we validate them, make them feel that, make them know that they're safe. And so, I don't have an answer to prevent it, because you can never predict when someone is going to attack you. But what we can do is vigilantly work to heal, and we can vigilantly work to make sure that we're constantly building towards a community of restoration, as opposed to punishment. So I think those are ways that we can really work together.
Can I say that Erica and Maya are great examples of exactly what to do? So Erica did more than just wrapped her arms around her mother. She said to her, whether she said it to her mother or not, I'm sure she said, I am going to be committed so that people like my mother do not have to experience this for the rest of their lives. And not just my mother, it committed her to the notion of racial and social justice. That's the way that we pay back. That's the way we respond to these situations. Our mothers, I understand that her mother could not respond in the way many of us could. And I know my parents could not respond. But I know the fact that they could not respond made me committed to the fact that I was going to be the voice that they could not be. And that's how we're going to do it. And think about people say, why is this education going to be, what's the value of it? Mai's a great example of it. Mai was able to take CAPE at a time where UMass Boston was the only university in the Northeast. It's one of the rare ones actually in the New England area that actually teaches ethnic Asian American studies in a big way. Harvard doesn't even offer it as part of their curriculum anymore. And none of and very few of the privates do, but we did. And she is a product of what it means to teach somebody, to introduce them to ethnic studies and what they can become. Mai is exhibit A of why the value of teaching and introducing kids to ethnic studies and Asian American studies is critical, because she has been not only somebody who's fought for her own identity, but fought for the justice and identity of other people around her. And she's a great example. Not that we're going to teach everybody into a Maidu, it'd be impossible, although it'd be a better America if we did. But in some respects, their sensibilities, her level of understanding is something that we can develop. She's the hope of she's exhibit A of what this all means. And if you have a problem with ethnic studies, then you got a problem with who Maidu is. And if you got a problem with Maidu is, you got a problem, I think, about the idea of democracy and the possibilities of it in American society today.
Well, with that note, I guess that's a beautiful conclusion of our program today. We really don't want to end, right? We can continue this conversation on and on. But I know it's already 9:23. And I want to thank our keynote speaker, Professor Watanabe, for your decades of devotion to the community and your teaching, your scholarship, and your support for the younger generation. I also want to thank our wonderful panelists for your community work, for your leadership. A few weeks ago, I attended the National Association of Asian American Studies conference. We talked about this. We talked about the current nationwide movement. So not just in Massachusetts, but in Illinois, in Connecticut, California. So this is the emergent, important nationwide movement. But Massachusetts should be the leader in this regard. So I really want to thank you for taking the leadership to develop this new legislation, to educate our community, to bridge different communities, to promote this great cause. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining us tonight and exceeding our expected time frame for talking with us, giving us all the wonderful the explanations of the bill and all the encouragement. I also want to thank our organizers, particularly NECAA. Hua and Kochiyama, do you have any closing remarks as the leaders of NECAA?
Would you like to say something?
Oh, thank you, everybody. Thank you, especially our distinguished, panel led by Professor Watanabe. And but really, this is a wonderful, wonderful event, and actually, the topic is so important and so timely. And I think let's all work together, make a good progress to make it happen. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Right. I also want to thank Ben particularly again for putting everything together in a very short time. Without you, this program won't be possible. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
Right.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you for all your support. It's all my pleasure. I'm so moved to see you all together here.
Yeah, Ben is our fearless leader. So.
And I also posted a sign-up sheet link in the chat. I hope everyone can sign up to support the bill H584. And then we need your support. We need volunteer, we need supporters to get this bill passed in both House and the Senate in the state of Massachusetts. Okay, thank you very much.
That's right. Let's take some actions. So if you have any question about the bill, about all the programs about the bill, please contact Ben or any of our panelists. Okay. With that said, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Have a good night. Please remember to join our next NECAA program, which will be just 1 week later, right, Ben?
Yeah, it will be next Wednesday. We'll be talking about how to, talk about like the curriculum framework from the state education department. So it's from another angle to see if we can do something about the AAPI history into the K-12 education.
That's right. Great. So we look forward to seeing you all again next time. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you all. Have a good night.